This sequence of videos will walk through Quine's paper on what there is, and we'll just sort of follow Quine's movement through the paper. Quine starts by talking about McX's argument for the existence of apparently non-existent objects. And McX is just an imaginary interlocutor that Quine dreams up, based, of course, on certain historical philosophers. So here's a sentence. Pegasus was birthed from Medusa's head. Now here's an argument. That sentence is meaningful. If that sentence is meaningful, then Pegasus must exist. Because if the word Pegasus, the idea goes, if Pegasus doesn't exist, then the word Pegasus refers to nothing, and therefore the subject of the sentence refers to nothing, and therefore the sentence doesn't really say anything. Therefore, since S1 is meaningful, and if it's meaningful, then Pegasus exists, we conclude Pegasus exists. Now, why accept that the sentence is meaningful? Well, let's compare Pegasus was birthed from Medusa's head, that sentence, to a series of other sentences. How about Black Abel int ak av it? Well, unlike this sentence, S1 seems to say something. It seems importantly different. How about head birthed Medusa Pegasus from? Well, again, unlike this sentence, S1 seems meaningful. See, unlike S2, S1 seems to include meaningful words. Unlike S3, or at least words that can be parts of meaningful sentences. Unlike S3, S1 appears to be grammatically sound. How about this one? Medusa was birthed from Pegasus's head. Now, crucially, S1 seems to differ from S4 as well. It seems like they have different meanings. But of course, they can't have different meanings unless S1 has meaning. Okay. What about what about premise 2, that if S1 is meaningful, then Pegasus exists? Well, here's an argument. If Pegasus doesn't exist, then we're not talking about anything when we use the word Pegasus. If we're not talking about anything when we use the word Pegasus, then sentences including Pegasus as referring expressions are meaningless. Therefore, if Pegasus doesn't exist, then S1 is meaningless, which is to say, if S1 is meaningful, then Pegasus exists. Now, we can conclude that Pegasus exists. So this is McX's argument, and he concludes on this basis that Pegasus exists. But along comes Quine, and Quine says, look, there's something that McX countenances, that just means, countenances here just means something that McX says exists that I don't think exists. And McX replies, but you just conceded the dispute when you said there is something that I countenance. When you said there is something that I countenance, you're saying something exists that I think exists that you do not. But of course, then it must exist. For to say there is something that I countenance is to say that that something exists. Quine replies, look, I'm not sure what to say, but if Pegasus exists, can you point at him? Surely Pegasus isn't flying around here somewhere. And McX says, of course not. Pegasus exists as an idea in people's minds. And now Quine is going to take issue with this idea. He says, but when one asserts S1, that Pegasus was birthed from Medusa's head, one isn't saying that an idea in people's minds was birthed from Medusa's head, nor is one saying that one idea was birthed from another. So the claim that Pegasus exists as an idea in people's minds doesn't yet explain why S1 is meaningful. And then Quine's going to go into some detail and say, let me explain it like this. And now what I want you to see is this isn't going to be a knockdown argument against the claim that S1 is meaningful. Rather, this is going to be an argument that if S1 is meaningful, then it can't be the case that Pegasus exists only. Sorry, I should put this more carefully. If S1 is meaningful and the meaningfulness of S1 requires that Pegasus exists, then it can't be the case that Pegasus exists in virtue of being an idea in people's minds. Okay, so again, it's a complex dialectic. The idea is this. Quine is not providing an argument against S1 being meaningful. Instead, Quine is providing an argument that says if S1 is meaningful, because Pegasus exists, or put another way, or maybe more perspicuous way, if S1 being meaningful requires that Pegasus exists, then it can't be the case that Pegasus exists as an idea in people's minds. So let's look at the argument. So often one rejects an argument by showing that it includes a false premise or fallacious inference. At this point in the dialectic, however, Quine isn't going to show that 1 or 2 is false, or that 3 doesn't follow from 1 and 2. Later, he's going to show that 2 is false. instead of attacking the Pegasus argument directly, Quine is going to reason as follows. 3 on its face, the claim that Pegasus exists, looks kind of crazy. Even if you, McX, admit that Pegasus isn't flying around here, it still looks like 3 is crazy. So you should explain how 3 isn't crazy. You do this by saying that Pegasus exists as an idea in people's minds. So it's like you, McX, say Pegasus exists. I say, but that's kind of crazy because obviously Pegasus doesn't exist. And you, McX, say, no, it's not so crazy. Pegasus exists as an idea in people's minds. And now what I'm going to do is show that doesn't work. Why? Because that sort of existence doesn't render S1 meaningful in the right sort of way. For somebody who asserts S1 isn't trying to say something about an idea. They're not trying to say, an idea was birthed from Medusa. The argument would have us accept 3 because that is the argument from the meaningfulness of S1 to the conclusion that Pegasus exists, would have us accept that Pegasus exists because we must do so in order to explain why S1 is meaningful. That's the idea that motivates 2, the claim that if S1 is meaningful, then Pegasus exists. But now accepting 3 doesn't help us explain why S1 is meaningful. So we lose the motivation for 2. So, McX, your argument is unstable. 2 initially seems plausible, but your explanation of 3 doesn't suit the motivation for 2. Okay, so let's look back here at the argument. Quine says your argument is unstable, your explanation of 3 doesn't suit your motivation for 2, and McX says, oh, and Quine declares victory. But then along comes Wyman, and Wyman says, not so fast. You haven't shown that either 1 or 2 is false, nor have you shown that the motivation for 2 is misguided. You've just shown that McX's explanation of 3 doesn't fit with that motivation. So, says Wyman, we just need a different explanation of 3. And that's what we'll take up in the next video.